My name is Rebecca Martin, and I'm wanting to thank you for joining us in a conversation about enterprise social collaboration this afternoon. We've recently released our 2016 social collaboration survey where we discovered that enterprise customers have built solid foundations for employee digital collaboration, but still struggle to adopt more advanced social and mobile enabled use cases and have barely started the transition to creating a holistic employee-centered digital workplace. So what's holding back this progression? Well, what we found is that the two biggest challenges are executive buy-in and insufficient staffing. But what can you control? The best thing you can do as a digital workplace leader is to focus on selecting the right fit technology for your organization, as well as anticipate the likely challenges you'll encounter and then plan to mitigate those. So today we're going to talk about exactly that. You're going to come away with a proven methodology for selecting the right solution for your enterprise, and the timing's perfect because we've just released a major update, version 6.0, of our enterprise social collaboration research, and I'll share more on that in a bit. So just a quick introduction to Real Story Group for those of you joining us on the phone that aren't as familiar. I'd say that there's a few different ways that we help organizations using our research as well as from advisory capacity. The first way is Real Quadrant. It's our shortlist builder tool. It's unique in the analyst industry, and it's really designed to get you to the right shortlist based on your specific use cases and strategic considerations. The second way is, how are you doing with the technology that you already have in place? We have a tool called Real Score, and it's going to help you benchmark your overall effectiveness. And then finally, the way a majority of our subscribers leverage our expertise is through our Plus subscription. It's really a combination of research and advisory. It's a real win-win for many of our subscribers. This next slide highlights what's near and dear to our hearts, our business model. This is unique in the analyst world, and we have yet to find another analyst firm really that adheres to this strict independence, but we don't work for vendors in any capacity, which really allows us to be the toughest critics out there. We're absolutely unbiased when we evaluate, where they're a potential good fit, and maybe more importantly for you, the technology buyer, where they're not such a good fit. And then what you can see on this next slide, it's a great visual that really shows the marketplaces that we cover and then the vendors that are kind of plotted along those subway lines, if you will, in each of those marketplaces. And we offer deep dive evaluations on all the vendors that you see on this vendor map. And if you like the visual, you can download it at realstorygroup.com. We have it available on our website. So before I turn it over to Tony, a few quick things to highlight. For everyone on the call, we will follow up with the slides, and we'll make those available. For the subscribers that we have on the line, you'll have an archived version of today's webinar that you can access. And then finally, if you do have any questions as we move through the presentation, feel free to just type it up in the question window, and then Tony at the end will take time to address some of those questions. So Tony, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you at this point. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks Rebecca. It's wonderful to have everyone here. As you can see, we cover a variety of different digital workplace and digital marketing technologies. Today I'm going to focus, and of course there's quite a bit of overlap among them, as you can see, but today we're going to focus on the red line here, which is enterprise collaboration and social software. I'm speaking to you today from just outside Washington, D.C., obviously a very, shall we say, interesting 24 hours for us, but I think that if there's any kind of tie-in here, it's maybe we should all take away the lessons that it's important to stay really connected, and it's important to make sure that we know sort of what's going on, and throughout, if you're in a large enterprise, maybe there's places and things going on and surprises that may come to you. And I'd like to think that this technology can be really important in terms of giving everyone, enterprise leaders and peers, a heads up about what's going on, and employee sentiments and desires and aspirations, but also hopefully make us feel a bit more connected, which certainly I think all of us could value in a more sort of human-centered digital workplace. But the question is, as Rebecca mentioned, what's the right fit for you? And so what I'm going to talk about today is kind of a methodology for selecting the right technology. So the first thing will be, the selection considerations, the criteria, if you will. And I'll share our particular evaluation methodology that we use in our own research. And then we'll talk about the vendor landscape. What are the tools out there? How do they differ? And then finally, describe what we call a sort of agile selection process. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And again, if you have any questions at all at any time, feel free to just use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely get to those. Or if there's anything that you agree with or disagree with, we can, in the interest of collaborating here, we can have a little bit of a conversation around it. So in terms of selection considerations or criteria, we divide it into a couple of different categories. So first is functional and enterprise services, and I'll show you what those are in a second. But the second, and I think more important terms of fit here, is actual scenario or use case fit, because this is what drives actual business value. And then finally, strategic considerations around the vendor and the ecosystem, also critical. So we'll start with functional and enterprise services, and for better or worse, this is where many people do start, because here we're kind of talking about features. So from a feature perspective, this is what we look at when we're doing these deep dive critical evaluations of these vendors. And we group them into a couple of different categories. And by the way, this approach is completely updated as of really this week. We've just come out, as Rebecca mentioned, with our latest version of this report, and I'm really excited about it because we very much modernized a lot of the criteria that we use. But in terms of just straight up features, we divide it into productivity, particularly personal productivity services versus collaboration services. So from a personal productivity, you have things like your profile services, filtering, search, potentially things like a personal dashboard. Whereas when you get over to collaboration, it's things that you do with other people, and social signals and that sort of thing. So you get commenting and rating, blogging, discussion services, very critical to many of these applications, collaborative editing, team tasks and calendaring, that sort of thing. So this is kind of a set of features, and I would say end user features, and these are important. Unfortunately, this is often where many enterprises just sort of start and end. So there's a couple other things you want to keep in mind. First, in terms of enterprise services, these are obviously really important as well. And sometimes we find that these are an afterthought in the selection process, and that can be a real problem because they don't always crop up when you're piloting something at a departmental level, but then when you try to take that pilot and spread it across the enterprise, suddenly you start running into some of these issues, and you have what we have come to coin as the enterprise surprise, which was a social collaboration platform that worked really well at a departmental and regional level, and then wasn't working so well at say a global level. So for example, under user experience, things that maybe your IT team thought were easy to use, potentially non-IT people might have found it a little bit more difficult. For example, we often see that with wikis, or a tool that wasn't properly localized for all of the different languages that you need to support around the world. Obviously, configuration management, lifecycle management, very important, particularly in very adaptive environments or where compliance and regulatory issues are important. And of course, scalability and security and entitlements, particularly important as you get into larger sort of multi-unit sorts of enterprises. So these enterprise services, they're not as sexy, but they can be very important for your success. But thus far, we've been talking about the tools and the features, and what I really want to direct you to is, I think, the most important set of criteria, the ones that really drive our own sort of interactive applications where you get access to our research, and that's around scenarios, common scenarios. And whether consciously or not, vendors do target these different scenarios. They're just not always very explicit about it. So we break out 10 common scenarios for social collaboration. On the left are those that are more collaborative, like building gold knowledge bases, repeatable projects, collaborating with partners, team communication, which is new, that's sort of like the Slack scenario, clearly innovation support, a lot of really great use cases there. So those are more collaborative. The ones on the right are a little bit more socially oriented, so socializing your existing work streams, developing communities of interest or communities of practice, social Q&A, or what we're starting to call answer engines, a lot of great use cases around that, expertise location, and then conversation and news, a little bit more prosaic, but still really important in kind of a social context. So these are actual use cases. These are business use cases that drive business value. And so that's why this is really we would argue, the more important thing to look at. And in fact, this is one of the two pillars or axes of our own quadrants that we've developed here. But then the other axis here is not so much around, what does the product do? We've been talking about features and what the product does, but more strategic considerations. And these really fall into three categories: the vendor, the tool, and the ecosystem. Let's talk about strategic considerations in connection with the vendor. One is, their professional services. Particularly if it's cloud-based, it could be very important that you will be using their professional services to do the implementation. How good is their customer support? Or really, from our experience, how bad is their customer support? I think for most vendors, that's really what we're talking about. Their overall strategy, and of course their viability and stability, which is how turbulent your journey is likely to be. And this one's really interesting because we often find that although people tend to sometimes be afraid of the viability of smaller vendors, we often find that smaller vendors can be more stable than larger vendors. They tend not to do as much mergers and acquisitions and move things around and kill products. And, for example, recently there's been a lot of rumors and concerns about the future of Yammer. And if Yammer was a freestanding company, you wouldn't be worrying about that so much because it's all they did and their livelihood depended on it, and they were going to be advancing it. Whereas Microsoft tomorrow could decide that in the context of some of the things that they're doing around Exchange, that they just don't want Yammer anymore. So viability and stability are important, and I just heighten the fact that in our own evaluations, we don't just look at the vendor size, but also what's the likely future. And the other strategic considerations around product. People tend to look a lot at roadmaps. We do look at product roadmaps. We find that they are maybe not as important as the underlying technical code base, the technical modernity, which is another way of saying how much technical debt are you taking on even from day one are you likely to experience going forward. Really important topic that goes, we believe, under-considered in many selection processes. And then, of course, value for money, right? Which is, are you paying the right amount for this? What's the overall TCO given the value that you're going to get? And then finally, the last set of strategic considerations is around ecosystem. So, and this is increasingly important, and this really is in our estimation one of the best predictors of the overall long-term longevity and health of a particular technology. Revolves explicitly around the health of the ecosystem in terms of channel implementation services, the overall community strength, the extent to which you can rely on third-party add-ons to extend the experience and integrate the experience, really critical for your long-term success. So let's then take a look at this kind of in action here, and I'm going to take from our research here. I'm just going to use Yammer as an example now. We have similar charts and ratings and pages of narratives to back this up for every one of the 24 vendors that we evaluate. But I'm just going to show you Yammer here. It's kind of interesting. I mean, Yammer does reasonably well in terms of the productivity services, presence and instant messaging. It has these decent mobile client, not a great mobile client. It allows you to follow colleagues and that sort of thing. Where it tends to fall down is in more wide-ranging collaboration services in the middle, where it really focuses on microblogging and activity streams, doesn't provide a lot of support for other sorts of things that you would want to do around collaboration. And that feature lightness there then plays itself out in a lot of different ways that I'll talk about in a minute. In terms of enterprise services, this is a very Microsoft-y platform. It's great at security entitlement, certainly to scalability and reliability. It's totally cloud-enabled. Although it's only available as a SaaS, so that can be pros and cons to that. What you don't get with Yammer, some of the other things, I'll highlight community management there as a really important one. Pretty light in terms of integration and extension. User experience is not very customizable, although it is localized across an impressive number of languages. So Yammer gets kind of mixed reviews there. The more interesting thing about Yammer is when you start lining it up against these use cases that I talked about before. And here's where really I think you see the essence of the tool in a business context. And this is really what we try to explain, what my wish for you is to be able to do this really effectively yourself, which is look at Yammer here. From a collaboration perspective, in terms of the business use cases, it's simply not very strong. You can do some team communication, but it's certainly no Slack, and Microsoft has built Microsoft Teams on a completely different stack. You can do a little bit of external collaboration, but it's limited by, lack of file sharing and other sorts of things in an effective way. When you look at Yammer, and this is no surprise, it tends to target more the social use cases, but really what it's really only good at, and even then in kind of an average way, is conversation and news, right at the bottom. You can kind of do these other things with Yammer, and people have tried, but you end up kind of fighting against the stream here. And I think that this one slide sort of shows the promise and the limitations of Yammer in the enterprise today, but not by so much focusing on the features, although the features are important, but the actual use cases that it's trying to fulfill. So that's the criteria, that you'll find in our research, and I invite you to download some free samples and look at it yourself. In terms of the actual vendors that we cover, they run the gamut. You have, of course, the major platform vendors, IBM, who is, really still pushing along with connections, although it is a little bit of an appendage to these days to some other IBM efforts around portals and document management. There's pros and cons to that. Of course, Microsoft, you have SharePoint and Office 365. They're increasingly very different environments. Our latest research goes into a lot of detail there. And then Oracle, which has had sort of a glancing interest over the years in social collaboration, really rather quiet recently, pushing a lot through their HR tools, for better or worse, I think mostly for worse. And then you have these major suites, which are very interesting, and in many cases either extend or even replace what the platform vendors can do. Drupal, a lot of change going on there. If you're interested, we can talk about. Google, still going after the enterprise market, although very much still an SM, small business play. SAP, a little bit more noise and signal there, and of course Jive, a long-standing player with many, global 2,000 customers. Some of the more interesting things are happening with the smaller suites like Atlassian, and then some of these, intranet in a box, social internet in a box, like Farmer Interact, Igloo, and others. And then you have this area of social enterprise layers and SharePoint supplements, Yammer, of course, being maybe the most famous, but also Nudezik, certainly Salesforce Chatter, Citrian, the former NewsGator, TIBCO, VMware. And then you've got some specialist players over here of note, Harmony, really filling in on the Microsoft stack, and of course Slack, which came almost out of nowhere and now really focuses on that team communications use case, which I think had been really underutilized. So, and of course there's other smaller players. You could extend this nearly ad infinitum with any number of other tools. We just think these tend to be the most important ones to look at. So you're certainly not lacking for choices here. And moreover, I think there's a lot of both anecdotal and survey evidence that suggests that going forward in the digital workplace, you're likely to have multiple numbers of these tools trying to suit those different use cases in different ways. So how do you figure out what's the right fit for you? Well, there's a tendency, of course, to say, well, something is the best product, right? And you can always find a quadrant to support you. This is a joke from my friend Martin White, who talks about the mystical quadrant, and obviously this isn't really the right approach. We offer an alternative to this, which is called Real Quadrant. And with Real Quadrant, using all of our research on the back end with the same vendors and the same products, you can come up with two very different quadrants. So this is actually using some data out of our enterprise portals research, which is similar to collaboration, but a little bit different. And what we did was we came together, and you can see these are two very different quadrants. And you could ask yourself, well, why is that? How is that? How could you, with the same research base, come up with two quadrants? And then just to reiterate here, the axes, the x-axis here is the scenario fit, which is how well does it execute on our scenarios we talked about, and then remember the 10 strategic considerations. That's the y-axis. How much do these fit our weightings for these considerations? So you go into our tool and you weight how important the scenarios are, you weight how important the different strategic considerations are, and then it generates a quadrant for you, and therefore can generate multiple quadrants for you. In this case, we had one use case where the emphasis was on internal collaboration and lower TCO. Got you one set of vendors over here. Notice Plone and SAP kind of at different places. And then the other one was, well, hey, I'm going to use my portals more for BI and dashboards, and my focus is on professional service channel because I need other people to implement this for me. And then you see that the two vendors basically got swapped out. So it's the same research, same vendor, same products. A generic quadrant isn't going to get you there, but a real quadrant that's based on your individual needs can get you there. And so this is something I would encourage you just to, log on to our site, go to the tools area, and even check it out yourself. So in terms of a process about how to do this, okay, so you use hopefully good research and create kind of your own shortlist, your own quadrant. You get aligned around that. You need to then sort of figure out, well, in creating that, are we going to be, what scenarios are we going to look at? And really focusing on practical applications. Try to identify in there the common areas where business units may be self-procuring, to see if you can find common solutions. And then make sure that you carefully test these tools, particularly if your intent is to extend them beyond an individual department and carefully test some of those enterprise services, like scalability, which has been an issue, for example, with Slack at some level in some organizations, that you don't want to just jump up and bite you on the behind, right? So you definitely want to avoid these four sort of traditional approaches. The first one we talked about, which is sort of the horse race, who's ahead, who's behind. The second one we see a lot in this segment down here in the lower left, which is love at first sight. I saw this tool, looked really cool, worked really great for me and my four people in my department, so therefore it's going to work for everyone else. And really, you have to understand that for all these tools, there's always competitors, there's always alternatives. You want to kind of view them in that context. Similarly, number three is the kind of my cousin Vinny approach, which is, well, it worked over here in this other organization, so it's going to work for us. But the reality is that you're probably different. Even if you're in the same industry, yes, you should talk to your peers, but your needs and your interests are likely to be different, and your level of maturity and your ability, certainly your culture and other things, and culture is obviously very important in social collaboration. So you shouldn't just rely on the advice of others. And the fourth thing is, what we sometimes see is happiness is a stack of warm binders, which is I'm going to develop all these detailed cross-tabbed requirements and lists of Excel spreadsheets, and that's going to tell me which tool is going to be best for me. I'm going to have the vendors fill in all of these check-the-box type grids and that sort of thing, and the vendors have seen all this and they can check all the boxes. The more time you spend doing that, in a sense, the more that your true priorities, your really important business scenarios, kind of get lost in all of that. And that's why it's so important to make sure that you key in on just what are the critical business scenarios and how much do you want to weigh them. So what you want to do is employ an empirical approach to winnowing down. And we describe this as a set of increasingly intimate series of interactions before you get married. So it could start with an RFP or a request for demos with your use cases, your own people, and then trying it out. Ideally getting hands-on, getting trained on the tool, trying it out in a proof of concept in a competitive way, and then maybe a pilot. The key thing there is really emphasizing testable narratives and practicing what we call ECD, which is our version of UCD, or user-centered design. Here we're talking about employee-centered design. In other words, really taking this from an employee's perspective, understanding what they want to do with what they can get out of this technology, and then moving forward from that perspective with personas and journeys and top tasks and that sort of thing. Remember, you're also likely to spend money on implementation services, whether those are soft skills or even more harder integration and technical work through a systems integrator. So you definitely want to do diligence on the implementation team. That's why we always recommend, for example, a competitive proof of concept where you can test out those implementers. So that was a brief tour of the criteria, the marketplace, and a selection approach. yeah, once again, I'll encourage you to ask some questions or put any comments in the GoToWebinar control panel under questions for anything that you'd like to share or discuss. And then Rebecca is going to talk a little bit about next steps here.
Sure, thanks. Really great. Thanks, Tony. So we had mentioned earlier that we've just completed a major update to our enterprise social collaboration vendor evaluations, and we now cover 23 different enterprise level vendors in this marketplace. And there's two things, two major enhancements that I wanted to mention. First, our evaluations format is much more impact oriented. So we're taking an in-depth look at the products, but we're also answering the all-important so what question for you. And then second, we've expanded the scope around strategic considerations, which will help you go beyond the technology to that more holistic understanding that we had mentioned earlier. So feel free to visit our website, realstorygroup.com, to download a sample of the research. You can test out the tools that we've talked about. We also have some great blogs that we've published that has helpful, useful information as well. You can also email us at engage@realstorygroup.com. We'd love to hear how we can possibly help you and your organization. So thank you. All right, Tony, any questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple in here. First, hi, Chris. Good to see you. I've got a question from Maishara. Strategic considerations vendor, you mentioned that smaller vendors are much more stable than larger vendors. Do you have some sort of figures that may actually represent this view? So it's not that they're always more stable than larger vendors. It's just that unless they actually sell themselves or go public, they tend to be very all in on their technology, whereas when the technology goes to a large vendor, it may not be very strategic for that vendor. And so when it stops becoming strategic for that vendor, it's an issue. Do I have actually data points on this? No, and I'm not really quite sure how we would do that, except to say that if I look at vendors that have, flamed out in this marketplace, yeah, there were 2 or 3 that have gone under or more or less exited the scene or gone in a different direction. But we've also seen Oracle itself kill 3 different collaboration products over the last 15 years. We've seen Microsoft go in a variety of different ways that were somewhat disruptive to its install base, including in Office 365, really pushing a lot of the strategic considerations around a lot of the collaboration around Exchange rather than SharePoint. So, that's just a small data point that probably for every tool that has exited the marketplace from a small vendor that never made it, we've certainly seen at least one case where a large vendor has done something very similar. So the other question is kind of a follow-up on this. It's around, I have been talking about SharePoint and Office 365. And this question is really around how I perceive the differences between SharePoint on-prem and Office 365 and SharePoint in the cloud. And well, that's a long conversation. That's the longest chapter in our research and goes into some detail about the differences, not just the technical differences, which I think are fairly well documented, but what does it mean from an employee context in terms of those scenarios that we outline. Your experience can be very different. I think it also revolves around Microsoft's intent. I think they were hoping that there would be a much more rapid shift from SharePoint on-premise to the cloud-based version. Their own customer base has not been able to pivot quite that rapidly. Much of that, by the way, is Microsoft's fault for not providing very good tools for doing that and for doing hybrid. It's really still more of a coexistence story. But I think the bigger story here is just Office 365 as a conglomeration of different tools that are each changing in their own direction, and I think Microsoft's having some trouble keeping them all coherent. It is allowing for much more rapid innovation. Something like Teams, which just came out, would never have come up in the old days of SharePoint on-prem. It's interesting to see that most of that innovation is coming out not of the SharePoint group, but out of, again, Exchange and Skype for Business. So a lot of good things happening with Office 365, but also a very different social collaboration, increasingly different social collaboration environment from SharePoint on-prem, and you've got to be really cognizant of that in your own internal kind of business and technical strategies. Joseph is asking, what's your view of Facebook Workplace? Well, we're just about to add that as we cover 24 products and 23 vendors. This Facebook Workplace is